Hello, everybody. I'm Todd Adwar,
I'm Peter Goodman.
and welcome to
Real
Essentials. So today we're going to talk about closings, and Pete's got some great stories for you on closings. And
I don't know if we have enough time for all those stories.
Well, I had a borrower, Pete, I guess last month, and we were clear to close, and they were supposed to close on April 30th, and the seller wouldn't close. And here they are, the lady was in tears. So I thought we'd talk about the closing process and what they should expect once their file is done.
Okay, great question. Look, when it comes to the closing process, really it starts and ends with the attorneys. You as a buyer or a seller need to be in touch with your attorney. A lot of times we'll get a call from our buyer and they'll say, oh, I was told I'm clear to close. I'd like to schedule a closing for Thursday at 2 o'clock. But that's not how it works, because even though the lender may be clear to close, there may be things on our side that everyone doesn't know about. So title is a big part of it. So let's say the seller has a title issue where there was an old mortgage, they thought they paid it off and it's still showing in the county clerk's records. They have to resolve that. Sometimes it takes extra time. A lot of times the seller may be buying another property. And really what's happening is the seller is in contract to buy another property. They can't close on that property, so they don't want to move out of the house, so they're not closing with you. And everyone thinks we're clear to close. The buyers calling movers, they're getting ready to go. And the answer is stay in touch with your attorney. Make sure that your attorney is in touch with the other side, so you have a way to set your expectations.
So as the buyer, can I force the seller to close up by a certain time?
Great question.
Because I have my movers coming,
right,
and my contractor's coming, and I want to close. I want to move into my house.
So there's no way to put a gun to someone's head and make them come to the closing table.
Okay.
Right? But we have some tools as attorneys. Obviously, ultimately, you can go to court and sue, but the problem with New York, and we're talking more New York closings, everyone has an attorney, and in New York, the only way to ultimately get relief is to go to court and get it,
Which takes 2 years.
A lot. Right. So if you're trying to close on Wednesday,
need to close next week.
You're going to go to court and you're going to get a judgment 2 years later. Not going to help.
Right.
So what happens traditionally is if a buyer breaches the contract, seller gets to keep the down payment. If the seller breaches the contract, the buyer gets to sue for specific performance. But what happens is we have dates in the contract, which are target dates. So it'll say on or about, which means you usually have 30 days. So number one, staying in touch with everyone, setting expectations, because if everyone knows at the beginning that the seller is buying another house somewhere else, part of this is knowing and having your ear to the ground with your realtors and with your team, knowing when everyone's expected to close. But if all else fails and you're ready to close, everyone's ready to close, and the seller's is not showing up, we do something called the time of the essence. So we send the time of the essence letter. It's a demand saying, look, if you're not at the closing table at this point in time, the buyers be ready, willing, able to attend to close. They can have their funds. Everything's be ready. You're not there. We're going to hold you in breach of contract, and we're going to sue.
So as a buyer, I really shouldn't be making any plans until you give me a date, because it could be they could keep me at bay for whatever time they want. And if I love this house and it takes me an extra 3 weeks because the seller doesn't want to move out yet, I'm still buying the house.
Right. There's not that much you can do. So the answer is, if you can lock in your rate before you just talk to your loan officer and they lock in a random rate, number one, you should have a conversation with the realtors and the attorneys, because look, you lock in your rate even though everyone says, hey, there's no reason why the seller's out of the house already, no reason why we're not going to be able to close in 60 days. 60 days comes, the seller's in Tahiti on a 3-week vacation, they're not closing, right? So you need to make sure that you have the information so we can set your expectations. And that's everyone. We talked about team, I think, in another podcast. Team is important. If you have the right team and if you're in contact with your team, those things are less likely to happen. We can't avoid every problem. We all know in life we can't avoid every problem. There are unexpected things happen. But making sure you're prepared and that you are in touch with the team and you have the right team, that's the best way to make sure that you get to the closing table when you expect to, and you're not paying to store your stuff because you had to be out of your house for a lease and the movers you had to cancel.
One of the things that you were telling me about is getting to the closing table after the walkthrough, and now the buyer sees something that is broken, and now, it's a free-for-all. Tell me about that.
Another good question. So this is what happens. Buyer does a walkthrough right before closing. The seller
Normally
promises,
the day before, right?
Normally, sometimes the morning of. I
Right.
want you to do the walkthrough as quickly, as close to closing as possible. Because look, you do closing the week before, and there's a storm or something, and all of a sudden you move into the house and there was a leak. There's not much you can do. You're buying it as is house, but a seller will generally promise that the property will be delivered with the plumbing, heating, electrical systems working order, and the roof free of leaks. If they promised anything else, it should be in the contract. The seller promised to fix something. You're going to schedule your walkthrough. Hopefully you had a home inspection at the beginning, and so now you schedule the walkthrough with the realtor the morning of the closing. You're closing at 3 in the afternoon. You get there at 10. You walk through the house with the realtor. You find the problem. First of all, we all have cameras, phones, right? You take a picture of the issue. You have your real estate agent there, so there's a witness. You take a picture. You call your attorney. Your attorney tries to work something out. Normally, what we're going to say to you is, look, maybe we can work out a credit. If it's something minor, we'll try to work out a credit. As attorneys, if something breaks in my house, I call someone, right? So if you tell me, well, how much of a credit should I ask for? We haven't seen the issue. So you should have an idea. Maybe, a contractor, maybe you call your home inspector, but you should have an idea if you're going to get a credit, how much are we going to ask for?
How small do you say, forget it, just let it go? I mean, if it's
It depends on the argument. Everybody, I've had arguments, believe it or not, over one burner not lighting on a 4-burner stove. I mean, everything else works. That's the one thing, and everyone's fighting about it. So you want to be prepared, but you have these conversations at the closing. A lot of times the seller's attorney is going to say, so they protect the seller, they're going to say, well, the house is as is, and it was like that at the beginning. The rule of thumb is if that condition existed before you went into contract, you're getting it like that. If the problem happens between contract and closing, the seller should fix it. The way to solve that problem mostly, go to look at your home inspection. You did a home inspection, the guy, the woman or man, whoever did it,
so you look
pictures,
at that.
And you say, hey, here, this is what it looked like when I did the inspection. This is what it looks like now. And that's a really good way to solve that problem.
Great advice.
And that's it. So when you're preparing to go to closing, make sure you do your walkthrough. Make sure that you stay in touch with all parties, your team, and make sure that all your issues are addressed by the time you leave the closing. Because once you leave the closing and we live happily ever after, right, the house is yours. So you want to make sure all those problems are addressed, if any, between contract and closing.
I'm Todd Adwar.
I'm Peter Goodman.
This is Real Essentials.